Hi YouTube. Today I'm going to be talking about books that feature females in aviation. I work at the 99s Museum of Women Pilots, and the 99s organization was formed in 1929 after the first ever Powder Puff Derby, which was an all-female race from California to Ohio that year. It featured 19 women competing against each other. And after the race was over, these women got together and decided that they needed a organization to represent female pilots. And so what happened was they sent an invitation out to all known women who held a pilot license. That was the only rules, where you had to be a woman and you had to have a pilot's license. And 99 women ended up answering this call, and that's why the name is 99s. And it's still a thriving organization today. The headquarters is also here where the museum is. But another great part about the museum, besides all the history we have, is that we also have a library, and this library has all kinds of books, and not just about women. There's a lot of books about like Charles Lindbergh, Wiley Post, Will Rogers. Especially the museum is in Oklahoma City, so that's one of the reasons why there is a lot of Wiley Post and Will Rogers, is because they're from Oklahoma. So if you're ever in Oklahoma City, feel free to stop by the museum, because it really is fabulous. It's a history that not a lot of people know about besides Amelia Earhart, and it's something really easy to learn about, and I feel like little girls everywhere should know about this in school, because it's very inspiring to see women being told, no, you can't do that, and then of course going and proving everybody wrong. When I first started working here, I didn't know anything about female pilots besides Amelia Earhart. So what my boss suggested I do was first read a book about the Powder Puff Derby in 1929. So this is the book that I read. She said that she read it too when she first started working here. It's by Janora Jensen, and if you look, it looks like it says it's Jean Nora, but it's pronounced Janora. She was a president of the 99. She is still a 99's member. So this book, it goes through all of the women who were in the Powder Puff Derby. It talks about their life before and during and after the race. So it's kind of like biographical. And at times it can get kind of boring, but it really introduces you to the topic about women. And since there's so many women in there, then you can kind of like pick one you're interested in and jump off that to read other books. Because there are some books that are actually by female pilots that are like autobiographical, and then there are a lot of books like this that are just about women pilots, especially if they died young. They didn't get to write a book about themselves, so other people have taken their letters and newspapers and all kinds of things and put those together to make their story. The second book I read is called West with the Night by Beryl Markham. Beryl was born in England, but she grew up in Africa, and so she learned how to fly there, and she spent her life flying people across Africa. She did a lot of cartography, and people who wanted to go on safaris and things, she would carry them. So it was interesting to hear her thoughts about colonization in Africa. And the reason I read this book is because Ernest Hemingway read her book when it came out, and he said that she was a better writer than he was. And I have always loved Ernest Hemingway, so I had to read it. And she is a very good writer. I don't think she's better than Hemingway, but it was a fun read. The third book that I want to talk about that I read is called Sharpe. It is about Evelyn Sharpe. She was from Nebraska, and she was a WASP during World War II. What WASP were is they were created by Jackie Cochran, and essentially what they did is they ferried airplanes from field to field. She was a very well-known aviator in the Midwest. She had lots of friends. This book, the author takes a lot of her letters and newspaper clippings from around her hometown and interviews with her family to put her story together, and you just see how bright of a personality that she was. Evelyn died in 1943 while she was going to ferry one of her planes. An engine gave out on takeoff and she crashed. But it's still a really interesting story. I have a story to tell of why I read this book, actually. So the reason I chose to read this book is because one day, two women came in and they were asking if we had anything about Evelyn Sharpe, and I had never heard of Evelyn before, and it turns out we do have some photographs of her in our World War II section, and their father actually knew Evelyn during World War II, and they told me that if Evelyn hadn't died, then they wouldn't be born because their dad would have gone off with her instead of their mom. They said when their dad started writing Evelyn, he stopped writing their mom. And so that was very interesting to me, so I wanted to read more about her. And I hope they've read the book since then, but it sounds like Evelyn had many beaux. She wrote to all kinds of men and was always dating men, so the statement that he would have married her might not be true just because she did have a lot of boyfriends. The next book I want to talk about is not about a female, it's actually about a male, but it was still a very interesting read, and I'll tell you why I wanted to read it. But it's called I Was a Nazi Flyer by Gottfried Lesk. And I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing that wrong. I'm German, but I can't speak German. So this book, Gottfried, he was a flyer for Nazi Germany. He was a bomb pilot, so while he flew the bomber to England, because he was part of the Blitz, and then the other people in the plane would drop the bombs out. So he kept a diary during this time, and eventually he was shot down over the English Channel, and he was taken prisoner, and he went to Canada, to a prison camp in Canada, where he continued to write letters to people, but it wasn't the same. So most of the book is actually his diary before he was taken prisoner, and there's just like a little bit after that, and I just think it's probably because the author. So the book was made while he was still like in prison, like it was made during World War II, so I think the author just wasn't able to get all of the letters and things. The only reason he got the diary is because Gottfried's friends and family were able to send it to him. Before he was shot down, he was home on leave, and he gave part of the diary to his best friend to keep. I'm not sure why he did that, if he was afraid of getting in trouble for keeping a diary, because you weren't supposed to keep a diary, because if you did get shot down, the enemy could find things out about the army and where you were and things like that. So I'm not sure it was like a precaution or if he was feeling paranoid, but he did give it away, so that's why we still have it. And it's just interesting. I've read a lot of diaries from the British perspective about World War II. I've read more about World War I, but I really was interested in reading this because I haven't read that many books from the German perspective. And it was crazy seeing some of the things that he thought, because he really did believe the propaganda that Hitler put out there. You can see him kind of fighting with this because he wants to follow Hitler and what he says, but at the same time he kind of challenges these ideas. And when he challenges these ideas, he's quick to be like, oh, but I'm sure the government has a reason for this, because he didn't want to get in trouble for thinking these things, because even he knew that you could be severely punished by the Nazi Party. Like, I think he knew what was going on, and he didn't want to be punished like millions of Jewish people were being. So it's kind of weird to see him tussle with these ideologies but still be in favor of Germany. So continuing with World War II, the next book I read after that is called Night Witches by Bruce Miles, and I highly recommend this book. I talked about how women in aviation, it's a history that not a lot of people know about, but this story is something like really no one knows about, and I feel like it's mind-blowing that no one talks about it, because it's an amazing story. So during World War II in Russia, at the beginning when Germany first started marching into Russia, they did kind of what they did to England. They did a blitz and were bombing lots of cities in Russia. And Russia, since they had the revolution and they were having a depression, civil war, everything that was going on, they didn't have enough pilots that were qualified to fight during World War II. So what happened is they recruited women. There were a lot of women who had their pilot's licenses. They were part of aviation clubs in Russia, and so the government approved of them becoming part of the army. So they did their training, and then they were separated into 3 different companies, and they had night bombers, they had fighter pilots, and then there were also day bombers and people who just ferried people and equipment between airfields. And this book, like, the stories in it just will, like, blow your mind, because the author actually interviewed these women who survived, some since there were fighter pilots and night bombers who would also get shot at by the Germans if they were caught in their spotlights. A lot of these women did end up dying during the war, and so the author talks about that. But all the survivors that he interviewed, he takes all their interviews and kind of, like, really interweaves them together really great to make the story. And he uses these interviews also to talk about the women who died, to paint a portrait of them too. So it's just really fascinating to read their stories. And a lot of them, they did receive, like, medals of honor from the Soviet Union, so they were recognized for what they were doing. And it talks about how they were treated by the other men who, they were part of the army and they were fighting alongside men, but they were still treated poorly by these men until they were able to show them, like a guy would say something to them and then they go fly and prove to them like they belong there too. So it's just a really great book. I can't believe I never heard about this until I read it, which blows my mind, because I've taken so many, like, university courses. I have my bachelor's in history, I'm getting my master's right now, and I never knew about this, so it just completely blows my mind. The last book I want to talk about, which is the most recent book I read, is called Queen Bess, Daredevil Aviatrix by Doris L. Rich. So it's a pretty short book, so if you want to read it, if you don't have a lot of time and you want to read something short, it's great. Bessie Coleman, she was the first African-American woman to get her pilot's license, and she did that in 1921. She was born in Texas. She moved to Chicago, and then a few years after that she decided that she wanted to fly, and there's a story behind that if you read the book you'll find out about. But so she wanted to fly, and since it was the 1920s, America was still very, very racist, and Jim Crow laws are going on, segregation was in effect. So she went to and talked to male pilots, and they would not train her, not only because she was female, but because she was black. So it's like she had 2 strikes against her being a minority, and so men would not teach her. So what she did is she learned French, and she went to Paris for a year where she learned to fly there, and she got her pilot's license there, and it was from a school that is accredited throughout the world. So she got her license and she could basically fly anywhere in the world after that. 1926 was when Bessie died. She was preparing for a exhibition flight she was doing the next day. She was scouting out where she was going to do a parachute jump, and the plane she was in lost control. She wasn't piloting it, but the pilot lost control of it because there was actually a wrench stuck in the controls, and she wasn't wearing her seatbelt, and the plane flipped and she fell to her death, which is awful. Bessie actually didn't leave behind a lot of materials like a lot of these other women did. There are some letters that they have, and then a lot of newspaper interviews, and the author did a lot of interviews with her remaining family members. The book was written in 1996, so her family was a lot older then, but the author took all this and put it together to make a very short look into what her life was like. So it was I enjoyed it. So those are all of the books I've read so far. There are still some more I want to read. This library that we have is huge, and there's all kinds of stories you wouldn't believe about strong females. One book I want to read is called Amy Johnson. Amy Johnson was a British pilot. I think it was in the 1930s, was when she soloed to Australia, and she was attempting to beat the record of non-stop flying to Australia, which she did. She was part of the ATA, which was essentially the British Wasps. They were first, but they also ferried aircraft from field to field where they were needed. She disappeared in 1941 over the Thames River, and they never found her body or her plane or anything, but they assume she died. The second book I want to read is called The Sky, My Kingdom by Hannah Rach. She was a test pilot for Germany during World War II. She was a German pilot. She is one of the most famous German pilots. And she's also the most famous female German pilot. So it's kind of like the same with the I Was a Nazi Flyer diary. I'm interested in seeing what she thought about what was going on during the war, like what motivated her to continue serving as part of the Nazi party. So those are all the books I've read so far, plus some books I'm wanting to read. Once I read some more, I will probably do another update if you all have enjoyed this update. I hope me talking about women in aviation has taught you a little history, maybe inspired you a little bit, and maybe you'll come by my museum sometime. I also have a Instagram for books. I will put the link below. And if you have liked this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel. And I will hopefully make some more book videos soon. Bye!